Racist waitress humiliates black elder man. Not knowing he is a veteran hero, a decorated veteran endures public humiliation at a restaurant, but his past holds a story of courage and resilience that will silence his aggressor. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. In a bustling American diner on a warm afternoon, the clinking of plates and murmur of conversations filled the air. The establishment, known as Pete's Corner Diner, sat at the intersection of Main and Oak Streets, its worn leather booths and chrome-trimmed counters telling stories of decades serving the local community. Tiffany Matthews worked the afternoon shift, her blonde hair tied back in a tight ponytail, her movements sharp and irritated as she navigated between tables. At 28, she'd been working at Pete's for 5 years, and her demeanor had grown increasingly hostile over time. Today, she handled orders with barely concealed contempt, particularly when serving customers of color. The diner was experiencing its usual mid-afternoon rush. Business professionals on late lunches occupied several booths, while a group of college students crowded around a corner table, their laptops and textbooks spread across the surface. Tiffany's face tightened every time she approached their table, where several Middle Eastern students were working on a group project. "Could we get some more coffee?" one of the students asked politely. Tiffany responded with a curt nod, deliberately taking her time to return with the coffee pot. When she finally came back, she barely acknowledged their presence, sloppily pouring the coffee and walking away before they could request anything else. In a quiet corner of the diner sat Mr. Johnson, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee as he observed the scene before him. At 75, his posture remained military straight, a habit ingrained from years of service. The Congressional Medal of Honor pinned to his jacket caught the afternoon's sunlight streaming through the windows, a silent testament to his sacrifice and bravery during the Vietnam War. Mr. Johnson had been coming to Pete's every Thursday for the past decade. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, scrambled eggs, and wheat toast. Today, however, something felt different. The usual warmth of the diner was overshadowed by an undercurrent of tension emanating from Tiffany's direction. The situation escalated when Mr. Johnson raised his hand to request a coffee refill. Tiffany, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout her shift, turned toward his table with visible reluctance. Her footsteps were heavy, her face set in a harsh expression that seemed out of place in the family establishment. "What do you want?" she snapped, standing at a distance from his table. Mr. Johnson maintained his composure, his voice steady and dignified. "Could I trouble you for more coffee, please?" Tiffany's response came like a thunderclap in the relative quiet of the diner. "You people are always wanting something more," she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "I've got paying customers to take care of." The diner grew quieter, conversations faltering as heads turned toward the corner. Mr. Johnson's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup, but his expression remained unchanged, years of facing discrimination having taught him to maintain his dignity in the face of ignorance. "I'm a paying customer," he stated calmly, reaching for his wallet. Tiffany's laugh was bitter and cutting. "Well, your kind isn't exactly known for good tips. Maybe you should try somewhere else next time." The metal on Mr. Johnson's jacket caught the light again, but Tiffany either didn't notice or chose to ignore its significance. Her words hung in the air, heavy and toxic, as other customers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The college students had stopped their work, staring open-mouthed at the scene unfolding before them. A businessman in a nearby booth slowly lowered his newspaper, his face darkening with each passing moment. The atmosphere in Pete's Corner Diner had transformed completely. What had been a normal afternoon of casual dining and friendly service had become a stage for something ugly and all too familiar. The scene was set for a confrontation that would change not only Tiffany's life, but the entire community's perspective on racism and respect. Mr. Johnson's mind drifted as Tiffany's words echoed through the diner. Images from decades past flooded his consciousness, not of other discriminatory encounters, but of the men he'd served with in Vietnam. His thoughts turned to Jimmy Martinez from Texas, who'd saved his life during the Tet Offensive, and Michael O'Brien from Boston, who'd carried him through jungle terrain after he'd been hit. Both had died in his arms, their blood mixing with the mud, caring nothing about the color of each other's skin. He remembered the night they'd all huddled together in a foxhole, sharing pictures of their families back home and dreams of what they'd do after the war. Race hadn't mattered then. Survival, brotherhood, and protecting American values had been their only concerns. His medal, now catching the afternoon light, wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them. At a nearby table, Lisa Chin watched the scene unfold while her 3-year-old daughter colored quietly beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. The way Tiffany spoke to Mr. Johnson transported her back to her own grandfather's stories. Tales she'd heard throughout her childhood about his service in the Korean War and the discrimination he faced upon returning home. Her grandfather, despite earning multiple commendations for his service, had been denied service at restaurants, refused jobs, and treated as a second-class citizen in the country he'd risked his life to protect. She remembered sitting on his knee as a child, asking why people had been so cruel. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand, little one," he'd say, "but we must never let their fear diminish our dignity." Lisa glanced at her daughter, Sophie, who remained blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding them. The little girl continued coloring her picture, occasionally looking up at Mr. Johnson's medal with curiosity. Lisa thought about the world her daughter would inherit and the responsibility she had to shape it. The businessman with the newspaper had set it aside completely now. His name was David Martinez, and he recognized the look in Mr. Johnson's eyes. It was the same look his father had carried until the day he died. His father, also a veteran, had faced similar treatment despite earning a Purple Heart in Korea. The memories of his father's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination strengthened his resolve. Lisa's chest tightened as she watched Tiffany continue her tirade, each word more venomous than the last. The veteran's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Tiffany's anger, as if his dignity somehow offended her. Sophie looked up from her coloring book, finally sensing the tension in her mother's body. "Mommy, why is that lady being mean?" Sophie's innocent question cut through the tension like a knife. Lisa looked at her daughter, then at Mr. Johnson, and finally at her own reflection in the diner's window. She saw her grandfather's eyes staring back at her, challenging her to be the change he'd always hoped to see. The weight of generational trauma and the responsibility to break its cycle pressed upon her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Lisa stood up. Her movement was deliberate, her chair scraping against the floor loud enough to draw attention. Sophie watched with wide eyes as her mother straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and took a step toward Tiffany and Mr. Johnson's table. The diner had grown eerily quiet, save for the oft humming of the overhead fans and the distant clatter from the kitchen. Lisa's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she moved forward, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind. "Sometimes, little one, silence in the face of injustice is as harmful as injustice itself." She felt the eyes of other customers on her, the college students, the businessman, the other diners who had been watching the scene with discomfort but hadn't yet found the courage to intervene. Lisa realized that this moment wasn't just about defending Mr. Johnson. It was about standing up for every silent victim of discrimination who had ever swallowed their dignity and walked away. As she approached Tiffany, Lisa's shadow fell across Mr. Johnson's table. The veteran looked up at her, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. In his gaze, she saw her grandfather, her father, and every other person who had ever faced discrimination with quiet dignity, waiting for someone to stand beside them. The time for silence was over. "Enough!" Lisa's voice, though not loud, carried across the diner with unexpected authority. She positioned herself between Tiffany and Mr. Johnson's table, her hands steady at her sides. "What gives you the right to speak to anyone this way, let alone a veteran who served our country?" Tiffany's face flushed red, her order pad gripped tightly in her hand. "This is none of your business. I'm handling my customers how I see fit." "Your customers?" David Martinez stood up from his booth, folding his newspaper deliberately. "I wasn't aware discrimination was part of the service here at Pete's." He moved to join Lisa, his presence adding weight to the confrontation. The college students at the corner table began to stir. Amira, One of the Middle Eastern students who had earlier requested coffee pushed back her chair. "We've watched you treat people differently all afternoon," she said, her voice clear and controlled. "Your behavior isn't just unprofessional, it's hateful." Tiffany's eyes darted between the growing number of people standing up around her. The typical lunch rush had transformed into an impromptu tribunal, with her actions under scrutiny from all sides. Her usual confidence wavered as she realized she no longer held the power in this situation. "You don't understand." Tiffany attempted to defend herself, taking a step backward. "I have a right to my opinions." "Opinions?" Another voice joined in, an elderly white woman who had been quietly eating her soup by the window. "Dear, what you're expressing isn't an opinion. It's bigotry, and it has no place here or anywhere else." The diner's kitchen doors swung open, and Carlos, the cook who had worked there for 20 years, stepped out. He heard everything through the service window. His presence added another layer of tension as he wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes fixed on Tiffany. "I've worked here longer than you've been alive," Carlos said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Pete's has always been a place where everyone is welcome." Everyone. The crowd had grown now, forming a loose circle around the scene. Mr. Johnson remained seated, his posture still straight, his eyes moving between the faces of those who had chosen to stand up for him. His medal continued to catch the light, a silent reminder of the principles of equality and justice for which he had fought. Sophie, still at her table, clutched her crayon tightly as she watched her mother stand her ground. The little girl's presence served as a powerful reminder of why this confrontation mattered. It was about shaping the world the next generation would inherit. Tiffany's defiance began to crack under the weight of collective disapproval. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized she was surrounded by people from different backgrounds, ages, and ethnicities, all united in their opposition to her behavior. I'm just doing my job," she stammered, but her words sounded hollow even to her in-ears. "Your job is to serve customers with respect," Lisa responded firmly. "Every single one of them. The uniform you wear and the privilege of serving others comes with that responsibility." The manager, attracted by the commotion, emerged from his office. Brad Wilson had owned Pete's for the past 5 years, inheriting it from his father. He took in the scene, his waitress surrounded by angry customers, Mr. Johnson sitting dignified in his corner, and the palpable tension in the air. "What's going on out here?" he demanded, though the look on his face suggested he already knew. Before anyone could respond, the sound of a coffee cup being set down drew everyone's attention. Mr. Johnson was about to break his silence, and the diner collectively held its breath, waiting to hear what the veteran would say to the woman who had just publicly humiliated him. The tension in the room had reached its peak. This moment would either escalate into something ugly or transform into an opportunity for change. The choice hung in the air, heavy with possibility, as all eyes turned to the corner table where a decorated veteran prepared to address his tormentor. Mr. Johnson rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and measured. At his full height, he stood 6 feet tall, his military bearing evident in every movement. The diner fell completely silent, the only sound coming from the gentle hum of the overhead fans and the distant traffic outside. "I was 20 years old when I first experienced real equality," he began, his voice deep and clear. "It was in a foxhole in Vietnam, 1968. The man next to me was white, from Georgia. He'd never spoken to a black man as an equal before that day. But when the mortars started falling, he didn't see color. He saw a fellow American. We shared the same fear, the same hope, the same blood." He reached up and touched his medal, not for dramatic effect, but as if drawing strength from it. "This medal isn't just mine. It belongs to every man in my unit who didn't make it home. White, black, Hispanic, they all died the same color. They all died American." Tiffany stood rooted to the spot, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. Mr. Johnson turned to face her directly, but his eyes held no anger, only a profound sadness mixed with determination. "Young lady, I've seen what hate does to people. I've seen it tear apart families, communities, and nations. I've seen it kill good men and women, and I've seen it poison the hearts of people who might otherwise have been decent human beings." He paused, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a worn photograph and held it up for everyone to see. It showed a group of soldiers, dirty and exhausted, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite their circumstances. This was my unit. The man on my right died, pulling me to safety. The one on my left gave his last blood transfusion to save another soldier. They didn't care about my skin color. They cared about my character, my actions, my heart. Mr. Johnson's words resonated through the diner, touching everyone present. The college students had their phones down, the businessman had tears in his eyes, and even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. I didn't fight for a white America or a black America. I fought for an America where my children and grandchildren could live free from the kind of judgment you've shown today. An America where people would be measured by their actions, not their appearance. He took a step toward Tiffany, who instinctively backed away. I don't want your fear, young lady. I don't want your hate. What I want is for you to understand that the freedom you enjoy today, the freedom to even express your prejudice, was bought with the blood of men and women of all colors. Sophie, still at her table, suddenly broke free from her mother's grasp and ran to Mr. Johnson. She held up her crayon drawing, a colorful mixture of stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The Veeder, Anne's stern expression softened as he accepted the picture. This child, he said, holding up the drawing, sees the world as it should be. No divisions, no hatred, just people together under the same sky. Somewhere along the way, adults learn to see differences where children see connections. The manager, Brad Wilson, stepped forward, his face set in a grim expression. But Mr. Johnson raised his hand. Before you make any decisions, sir, remember that firing her won't solve the deeper problem. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to change. The diner remained silent, the weight of Mr. Johnson's words settling over everyone present. His story had transformed the atmosphere from one of confrontation to one of reflection. The veteran's dignity and wisdom had turned an ugly moment into an opportunity for growth and understanding. Tiffany's hands trembled as she clutched her order pad, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The crushing weight of shame pressed down on her shoulders as Mr. Johnson's words penetrated the walls she'd built around her prejudices. For the first time, she really looked at the metal on his jacket, understanding its true significance. Her voice cracked. She couldn't finish her sentence. The reality of her actions crashed over her like a wave, drowning her previous certainties in a flood of recognition. Around the diner, others began to share their stories, each voice adding to the powerful moment Mr. Johnson had created. An elderly Asian woman spoke up from her booth near the window. "I was in an internment camp during World War II," she said quietly. "I was just a child. When we were released, many treated us like enemies in our own country. But there were always those who stood up for us, who saw us as people first." David Martinez, the businessman, stepped forward. "My father couldn't get a loan to start his business after returning from Korea, despite his Purple Heart. A white veteran from his unit co-signed for him. That man became my godfather." Amira, the college student, wiped tears from her eyes as she shared her story. "After September 11th, my family faced so much hatred. But our neighbors formed a human chain around our mosque during prayers to protect us. They didn't share our faith, but they shared our humanity." Each story resonated through the diner, creating a tapestry of shared experiences and understanding. The atmosphere had transformed from one of confrontation to one of connection. Even the kitchen staff began sharing their experiences with discrimination and the people who had stood up for them. Brad Wilson, the manager, listened to each story with growing comprehension. His own grandfather had been a World War II veteran who spoke often about the black soldiers who saved his life in the Battle of the Bulge. He'd never fully appreciated those stories until now. Sophie, still standing near Mr. Johnson, reached out and took Tiffany's hand. The simple, innocent gesture broke something in the waitress. She sank into a nearby chair, tears flowing freely now. "I was taught," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was raised to—" She stopped, realizing for the first time how hollow her justification sounded. "I've never really known anyone different from me. I just believed what I was told." Lisa sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Recognition is the first step toward change," she said softly. "My grandfather used to say that hatred is taught, but so is love. It's never too late to learn a new way of seeing the world." The college students began sharing their own stories of leaving their home countries, of facing prejudice, and of finding unexpected allies. Each narrative wove together with the others, creating a powerful testament to both the persistence of discrimination and the strength of those who fight against it. Carlos, the cook, brought out fresh coffee for everyone. The simple act of serving and sharing food became a symbol of community and healing. People began to move chairs and tables together, creating one large gathering rather than separate groups. Mr. Johnson watched as the diner transformed into something more than just a restaurant. It became a space for honest dialogue and understanding. His own pain had become a catalyst for change, his dignity in the face of hatred opening a door for others to share their experiences and for at least one person to begin questioning their prejudices. Tiffany sat quietly, absorbing everything around her. Each story chipped away at the foundation of her beliefs, forcing her to confront the real human impact of prejudice. The faces around her were no longer abstract categories, but real people with real stories, real pain, and real humanity. Unable to bear the weight of the moment any longer, Tiffany excused herself and retreated to the employee break room at the back of the diner. Her hands shaking, she stood before the small mirror mounted on the wall, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at her. The break room, with its flickering fluorescent light and faded motivational posters, had always been her refuge during difficult shifts. Now it felt like a confessional booth, forcing her to confront truths she'd spent years avoiding. Her uniform, usually worn with a sense of authority, now felt like a costume that exposed her prejudices rather than concealed them. Tiffany splashed cold water on her face, watching droplets fall into the steel sink. Each drop seemed to carry a memory. Her father's casual racist remarks at the dinner table, her mother's whispered warnings about those people, the segregated social circles she'd grown up in. She'd absorbed these attitudes like osmosis, never questioning their validity until this moment. "Who am I?" she whispered to her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked haunted, her mascara slightly smeared, her confident facade cracked. She thought about Mr. Johnson's photograph, those soldiers standing together, their arms linked in brotherhood. How many times had she served veterans without considering their sacrifices? How many stories had she dismissed without hearing them? Through the break room's thin walls, she could hear the continued conversation in the dining area. The voices were gentle now, sharing experiences, building bridges across divides she'd always considered uncrossable. She thought about Sophie's innocent gesture, taking her hand without hesitation or judgment. Children had to be taught to hate, she realized. Someone had taught her. Brad knocked softly on the door before entering. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Tiffany. His face showed concern rather than anger, though she knew her job hung by a thread. "My grandfather," he began, sitting down at the small break room table, "used to tell me about a black soldier who dragged him to safety in Germany. He said that was the day he understood that courage and character don't have a color. I never really got it until today." Tiffany accepted the coffee with trembling hands. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Maybe that's the problem," Brad replied. "Maybe we're too focused on fixing things quickly instead of understanding them deeply. Mr. Johnson didn't ask for you to be fired. He asked for something harder. He asked for you to change." The gravity of the situation settled over Tiffany. Every interaction she'd had with customers of color played back in her mind. The subtle slights, the delayed service, the underlying hostility she'd never acknowledged before. She saw herself through their eyes, and the image made her stomach turn. Lisa appeared in the doorway, Sophie still holding her hand. The little girl broke free and ran to Tiffany, holding up another crayon drawing. This one showed stick figures of different colors holding hands. "I made everyone together," Sophie explained proudly, "like in Mr. Johnson's picture." Tiffany accepted the drawing, tears falling onto the bright crayon marks. The simple wisdom of a child had cut through decades of learned prejudice. She looked at Lisa, seeing not an adversary, but another human being who had chosen to confront hatred with compassion. "I want to learn," Tiffany said finally, her voice stronger. "I want to understand. I don't want to be this person anymore." The words cost her everything she'd built her identity around, but as she spoke them, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't redemption, that would take much longer, but it was a beginning. The first step on a long journey toward becoming someone different, someone better. Through the break room window, she could see Mr. Johnson still sitting at his table, now surrounded by people sharing stories and coffee. His dignity had accomplished what 1,000 angry confrontations couldn't. It had cracked open a heart hardened by prejudice and let in the first rays of understanding. When Tiffany emerged from the break room, the diner had transformed. Tables had been pushed together to form one long community table, with people from all walks of life sharing stories over fresh coffee and hastily prepared plates of food that Carlos had begun serving. Mr. Johnson sat at the center of it all, not by design, but by the natural gravity of his presence. His metal caught the late afternoon sun, but it was his quiet dignity rather than the military decoration that commanded attention. He looked up as Tiffany approached, his expression neither condemning nor particularly forgiving, simply waiting. "Ah!" Tiffany started, her voice catching. She cleared her throat and started again, louder this time, so everyone could hear. "I want to apologize, not just to Mr. Johnson, but to everyone I've ever treated with disrespect in this diner. My actions were inexcusable." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She forced herself to continue, knowing that easy words weren't enough. "I know an apology doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't erase what I've done or said, but I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to be better." Mr. Johnson studied her for a long moment before gesturing to an empty chair beside him. "Sit," he said simply. "Listen, learn." Tiffany sat down, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. But instead of judgment, she found something unexpected: hope. The college students made space for her. David Martinez poured her a cup of coffee. Lisa smiled encouragingly. "My unit in Vietnam," Mr. Johnson began, his voice carrying across the now quiet diner, "had men from every background you can imagine. We learned that prejudice is a luxury you can't afford when your life depends on the person next to you. The bullet doesn't care about the color of the person it hits." Others began sharing their stories again, but this time directed at Tiffany. Amira spoke about leaving her home country, about the fear and hope that accompanied her family's journey to America. Carlos shared memories of his father, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through culinary school, facing discrimination at every turn but never losing his dignity. Brad watched from near the counter, seeing his diner become something more than just a place to eat. It was becoming a space for healing, for understanding, for the kind of conversations that rarely happen in today's divided world. Sophie, still drawing at her table, created picture after picture of people holding hands, sharing them with everyone in the diner. Her childlike wisdom continued to underscore the absurdity of learned prejudice. "I'd like to make this regular," Tiffany said suddenly, surprising herself as much as everyone else. "Not just today, but every week. A time when people can come together, share their stories, really talk to each other. I want to help make that happen." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. "Change happens one conversation at a time," he said. "One person at a time. One heart at a time." Brad stepped forward. "We could do it every Thursday afternoon," he suggested. "Make it official. Pete's community table." The idea spread through the room like wildfire. People began offering suggestions, volunteering to help organize, promising to bring others who needed to be part of these conversations. The diner, which hours ago had been a scene of ugly discrimination, was becoming the birthplace of something powerful. Tiffany looked around the room, seeing each face clearly for the first time. She saw people, not categories, not stereotypes, just people, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes. The weight of her previous beliefs began to feel lighter, replaced by the heavier but more meaningful burden of growth and change. Mr. Johnson reached into his wallet and pulled out another photograph. This one showed him with his unit after a particularly difficult mission. "We called ourselves the Rainbow Platoon," he said with a small smile. "Not because of our skin colors, but because we promised each other we'd find hope after every storm." Over the following weeks, Pete's Diner became more than just a local eatery. Every Thursday afternoon, the usual lunch rush gave way to what became known as Community Table. Tiffany, who had requested to work every one of these shifts, transformed from being the diner's shame to becoming its agent of change. She started small, learning names first. Muhammad wasn't just the man who ordered vegetarian omelets. He was a physics professor who'd fled Syria with nothing but his doctoral thesis. Mrs. Chen wasn't just the old woman who liked extra crispy bacon. She was a former teacher who'd taught English to immigrants for 40 years. Each person who walked through the door carried a story, and Tiffany made it her mission to learn them all. Mr. Johnson became a regular fixture at these gatherings, though he rarely spoke about his war experiences anymore. Instead, he focused on teaching through quiet example. He showed Tiffany how to really listen, not just to words, but to the silence between them, to the things people were afraid to say. "The hardest prejudices to overcome," he told her one afternoon, "are the ones we don't even know we have." Tiffany took this lesson to heart. She started noticing her own subtle biases. The way she automatically spoke slower to anyone with an accent, how she assumed certain customers couldn't afford certain dishes, the unconscious judgments she made based on appearance. Each recognition became an opportunity for growth. The diner's transformation attracted attention. Local news covered the story, focusing not on the initial incident, but on what grew from it. Other businesses in town began asking how they could implement similar programs. Brad found himself giving impromptu seminars to other restaurant owners about creating inclusive spaces. Carlos expanded the menu to include dishes from different cultures, working with regular customers to perfect recipes. Each new dish came with a story card explaining its cultural significance. The diner's walls, once decorated with generic Americana, now featured photographs and stories from the community. The college students who had witnessed the original confrontation became regular participants. They started a program where international students could practice English over coffee with local residents. Amira, now graduating, credited these conversations with helping her feel truly at home in America for the first time. Lisa and Sophie continued to attend every week. Sophie's crayon drawings became a permanent installation on one wall, a growing gallery of childhood wisdom about equality and friendship. Other children began adding their own artwork, creating a vibrant testament to uncorrupted perspective. But the most profound change was in Tiffany herself. She began taking classes at the local community college, studying social justice and history. Why? She started a blog documenting her journey from prejudice to understanding, sharing her struggles and revelations with brutal honesty. "The hardest part," she wrote in one post, "isn't admitting you were wrong. It's realizing how much damage your wrongness has done, and knowing you can never fully make up for it. You can only try to be better, every day, with every interaction." Mr. Johnson read every post, sometimes offering quiet guidance, other times just a knowing nod. He understood that real change wasn't a destination, but a journey, and Tiffany was just beginning hers. The diner's regular customers noticed the change in her. Gone was the sharp edge to her voice, the barely concealed contempt. In its place was genuine interest, real care, and an eagerness to learn. She made mistakes, still caught herself in old patterns sometimes, but now she acknowledged them openly and worked to do better. Brad noticed something else too. Business was improving. People were driving from neighboring towns to be part of these Thursday gatherings. The diner was becoming known not just for its food, but for its atmosphere of genuine connection and understanding. "My grandfather would be proud," he told Mr. Johnson one afternoon. This is what he always said a diner should be, not just a place to eat, but a place to belong. As Community Table entered its third month, Tiffany decided to organize something bigger. Working with Brad and Mr. Johnson, she planned a special evening event titled Stories of Service and Survival. The idea was to bring together veterans from different backgrounds to share their experiences, focusing on how diversity had strengthened their units and saved lives. The local paper ran a feature about the upcoming event, highlighting Mr. Johnson's story and the diner's transformation. The article caught attention beyond their small town. drawing interest from neighboring communities and even a local television station. "We need to be careful," Mr. Johnson cautioned during the planning. "This isn't about publicity. It's about understanding." Tiffany nodded, taking his words to heart. She'd learned enough by now to recognize the difference between genuine change and performative activism. The event had to maintain the intimate, authentic feeling of their Thursday gatherings while accommodating a larger audience. The night of the event, Pete's Diner was transformed. Tables were arranged in a large circle, with Mr. Johnson's regular booth serving as a kind of speaker's corner. Veterans from World War II through Afghanistan had come to share their stories. The crowd spilled onto the sidewalk, where additional chairs had been set up under strings of lights. Just as Mr. Johnson was about to begin the evening, a familiar face appeared at the door. Jerry Matthews, Tiffany's former colleague and close friend, stood watching the scene with obvious disdain. He had quit shortly after Tiffany's incident, refusing to work in what he called a politically correct circus. Well, Jerry announced loudly, stepping into the diner. "Looks like the social justice warriors have taken over completely." His voice carried an edge that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Tiffany felt her stomach clench. Jerry had been her mentor when she first started at Pete's, and many of her former prejudices had been reinforced by his influence. She recognized in his swagger and tone the person she used to be, someone who masked fear with aggression and insecurity with hatred. "This is a private event, Jerry," Brad started to say, but Mr. Johnson raised his hand. "Let him stay," the veteran said calmly. "Everyone is welcome here." Jerry laughed harshly. "That's right. Welcome to the Great Awakening, where we all pretend the world is one big happy family." He looked directly at Tiffany. "I expected better from you, Tiff. You used to understand how things really work." The room tensed. Several veterans straightened in their seats, calm, bat instincts never fully forgotten. But before anyone could respond, Sophie walked up to Jerry, holding one of her drawings. "This is for you," she said innocently. "It's everybody together, because that's how it's supposed to be." Jerry stared at the child's artwork, his rehearsed anger momentarily derailed by pure innocence. In that moment of hesitation, Mr. Johnson spoke. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "why don't you sit down and listen? Not to argue, not to fight, just to listen. You might hear something that surprises you." The invitation hung in the air. Jerry's presence had created a critical moment. Would the evening descend into confrontation, or could it demonstrate the very transformation it was meant to celebrate? The diner's transformation was about to face its biggest test yet. But before Jerry could respond, he pulled out his phone and started recording. "This'll make great content for my blog," he sneered. "Show everyone how the social justice mob operates." The tension in the room shifted from uncertainty to genuine concern. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice anymore. It was about protecting the safe space they created and the vulnerable stories people had come to share. Mr. Johnson rose slowly from his seat, his presence commanding attention despite Jerry's disruptive behavior. "That phone," he said quietly, "is a weapon you're using to hurt people who've already been hurt too much. Is that really who you want to be?" Jerry's hand wavered slightly, but he kept recording. "People need to see what's really happening here. How you're all brainwashing. What's really happening here." A new voice interrupted. An elderly white veteran in a wheelchair rolled forward. "I'll tell you what's happening. I'm finally telling the story of how a black medic saved my life in Korea when others walked past me. A story I was too ashamed to tell for 50 years because I used to think like you." Another veteran stood up. "I'm sharing how my Muslim translator in Afghanistan took a bullet meant for me, and how that made me question everything I'd been taught about who my enemies were." The stories kept coming, each one more powerful than the last. Jerry's phone remained up, but his confident sneer began to fade as he found himself documenting something very different from what he'd expected. Tiffany stepped forward. "I used to be just like you, Jerry. You taught me a lot of what I believed. But look around this room. Really look. These are real people with real stories. Stories that deserve to be heard, not mocked." Suddenly, another figure pushed through the crowd. A man in a police uniform. "Jerry Matthews?" he asked. "We need to talk about some concerning online activities we've been monitoring." The officer, Detective Rodriguez, revealed that Jerry had been part of an organized online harassment campaign targeting veterans of color, including Mr. Johnson. His blog had been orchestrating coordinated attacks on various community integration efforts across the state. The revelation stunned the room. Jerry's phone dropped to his side as the color drained from his face. The performative confidence vanished, revealing the frightened, angry person beneath. Mr. Johnson spoke again, his voice firm but compassionate. Hatred is a prison, son, one you build yourself, wall by wall, lie by lie. But here's the thing about prisons, you can also choose to walk out. Detective Rodriguez stepped closer to Jerry. You have two choices right now. We can do this the hard way, or you can cooperate with our investigation into these harassment networks. Help us understand how they operate and help other people find their way out. The diner fell silent. Jerry looked around the room, seeing not the angry mob he'd expected, but a community united in both strength and compassion. His gaze fell on Sophie's drawing, still clutched in his hand. Jerry's voice cracked. I don't know how to be different. That's why we're here, Tiffany said softly. That's what this place is for. Remember how you helped me when I first started working here? Let us help you now. The tension in the room gradually dissolved into something more profound. A recognition that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the strongest prejudices could be overcome. Detective Rodriguez would still need to do his job, but the community had shown that accountability could coexist with compassion. Mr. Johnson returned to his seat, picking up where the evening was meant to begin. Now, let me tell you about a group of men who learned to see past their differences in the muddy fields of Vietnam. The diner settled in to listen, transformed once again from a battlefield of ideologies into a space of healing and hope. Jerry, under Detective Rodriguez's supervision, sat down too, finally ready to hear stories that might change his life, just as they had changed Tiffany's. The evening became not just a celebration of diversity and service, but a powerful testament to the possibility of change, even in those who seemed most resistant to it. Pete's Diner had become more than a restaurant. It was a beacon of transformation, one story, one person, one heart at a time.